Marjane Satrapi, the Iranian-French artist, filmmaker and author of the autobiographical graphic novel Persepolis, has died at the age of 56. Marjane Satrapi's family said she had died of sadness a little over a year after the death of her husband.
She survived revolution, exile, controversy, and decades in the public eye. She turned her life story into an Oscar-nominated phenomenon and became one of the most influential artists of her generation. But now, at 56, Marjane Satrapi is gone. And what her family says led to her death isn't what most people would expect. In fact, many doctors once questioned whether it could even happen at all. It sounds more like something out of a novel than real life. A broken heart. What happened to this extraordinary woman in her final years? The girl who grew up in a revolution. Before Marjane Satrapi became a literary icon, she was just a little girl growing up in one of the most turbulent political climates in modern history. Born on November 22, 1969, in Rasht, Iran, and raised in Tehran, Satrapi came from a family that was anything but ordinary. Her parents were modern, politically engaged, and fiercely opposed to the Shah, which, as anyone who knows Iranian history can tell you for free, put them right at the center of one of the most explosive eras in the country's story. When the Iranian Revolution swept through in 1979, Satrapi was just a child, watching the world she knew transform into something frightening and unrecognizable. The Islamic Republic rose, war with Iraq followed, and the freedoms her family had known began to disappear, one by one. For a young girl from a progressive household, this wasn't just politics. It was personal. It shaped everything. Even before the revolution, Satrapi was never the kind of child who quietly accepted the world as it was. In Persepolis, she famously described believing she would one day become a prophet, holding long conversations with God, and imagining a future where she could solve society's injustices. It's a charming childhood memory on the surface, but it also reveals something important about her. Even as a little girl, she was trying to make sense of a world that often seemed unfair. Her parents, desperate to give her a future, made the agonizing decision that many immigrant families know all too well. They sent their teenage daughter abroad. Marjane was packed off to Vienna, Austria, to study alone in a foreign country, far from home, far from everything she loved. Vienna, however, was nothing like the escape her parents had imagined. Instead of freedom, she stepped into isolation. She arrived as a teenager who didn't speak the language fluently, didn't understand the culture, and didn't have a stable place to land. What was supposed to be education quickly turned into survival. Satrapi later described those years as emotionally disorienting. She moved between temporary living situations, struggling to find consistency in a world that didn't feel like it had space for her. At times, she felt invisible, like she was drifting through a city that never fully acknowledged her presence. And underneath it all was something heavier. Identity confusion. She was no longer fully connected to Iran, but she wasn't becoming Austrian either. She existed in a strange, in-between space, carrying her homeland in her memory while trying to adapt to a completely different reality. It was during this period that loneliness stopped being occasional and started becoming constant. She was a teenager. Can you imagine surviving that kind of displacement? That's just the beginning of her story, because what came next would make the whole world pay attention. Persepolis, the book that changed everything. After Vienna, Satrapi returned to Iran, earned a degree in visual communication and graphic arts in Tehran, and eventually made her way to Paris in 1994, the city where her international career would truly take off. France became her home, her creative sanctuary, and ultimately the place where she would find both her voice and her audience. In the early 2000s, she published Persepolis, a graphic memoir unlike anything the literary world had seen before. Told in stark, expressive black and white illustrations, the book was her own story. Growing up during the Revolution, being sent into exile, struggling to belong in Europe, and ultimately grappling with what it meant to be Iranian in a world that barely understood her country. It was raw, funny, heartbreaking, and politically sharp all at once. The book resonated because it did something rare. It made the political deeply human. Readers who had never heard of the Iranian Revolution suddenly understood it through the eyes of one girl. It became a global bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, assigned in schools and universities across the world. Satrapi didn't just write a memoir, she changed the conversation. But what made Persepolis explode culturally wasn't just that it was well written, it was what it revealed. At a time when global conversations about Iran were dominated by politics, sanctions, and conflict, Satrapi shifted the focus back to everyday life. Suddenly, readers weren't looking at headlines anymore. They were looking at families, children, teachers, friends, and ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary circumstances. That shift changed everything. And then there was the format itself. Graphic novels were still fighting for serious literary recognition at the time. Many people didn't take illustrated storytelling seriously outside of children's books. Satrapi challenged that perception completely. She used stark black and white illustrations to tell a story about revolution, exile, identity, and trauma with a level of emotional clarity that traditional prose sometimes struggles to capture. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a reframing of how an entire region could be seen. She followed it up with more books, embroideries, chicken with plums, children's works, and built a reputation as one of the most distinctive illustrators and storytellers of her generation. Her style was unmistakable, bold, clear, politically charged, and deeply personal. But here's the thing about Marjane Satrapi. She was never content to stay in one lane. So what happened when she took her story from the page to the big screen? From the page to the Oscars. Let's talk about the moment that put Marjane Satrapi on the global cultural map in a way that even her best-selling books hadn't quite managed. In 2007, she co-directed the animated film adaptation of Persepolis, bringing her black and white illustrated world to life on the big screen in a way that was visually breathtaking and emotionally devastating. The film was an international sensation. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, where it won the Jury Prize. Then came the Academy Awards, and the nomination that made history, Best Animated Feature. Think about that for a moment. A graphic memoir about a girl growing up in revolutionary Iran, drawn by hand, co-directed by its author, competing at the Oscars. That is not a normal trajectory. That is extraordinary. The nomination cemented Satrapi's status as a rare cross-media creator, someone who could move fluidly between literature, illustration, and cinema without losing what made her work uniquely hers. She didn't stop there. She directed Chicken with Plums as a live-action film in 2011, and later took on Radioactive in 2019, a biopic about Marie Curie. She was building something remarkable, a career that defied easy categorization. She wasn't just an artist. She was a public intellectual, a vocal critic of Iran's clerical regime, a passionate advocate for women's rights, especially as Iran erupted in protest in the years before her death. The woman, life, freedom movement meant something deeply personal to her. This was her homeland. These were her people. She was not quiet about it. So how does a woman this vital, this creative, this engaged with the world end up dying of a broken heart at 56? To understand that, you need to know about the man she loved. The love of her life. Marjane Satrapi. Here's where the story takes a turn that feels almost too painful to tell. By all accounts, Marjane Satrapi had found in Marjane Satrapi something that people who knew her described in the most unambiguous terms: the love of her life. Not a partner, not a companion. The love of her life. Marjane Satrapi died in April 2025. He was 53 years old. What happened to Satrapi in the months that followed was documented, quietly and heartbreakingly, on her own Instagram. Post after post expressed the same thing in different words: that she had lost the love of her life, that something central to her existence had been taken. People who knew her could see it. The grief was not the kind you push through. It was the kind that takes everything with it. After Matthias's death, those closest to her described a visible change in how she moved through the world. Her public presence, once defined by sharp commentary and creative reflection, gradually shifted into something quieter, more personal, more fragile. Followers who paid close attention to her posts began noticing that pattern. She didn't hide what she was feeling. She spoke about absence, about the strange silence left behind when someone who anchored your entire life is suddenly gone. There was no attempt to soften it for public consumption. Grief, in her case, wasn't abstract. It was structural. It changed the shape of her daily life. People often talk about grief as something you get through, but what she appeared to experience was something else entirely. A reorganization of existence around a loss that couldn't be repaired. That's where the foundation came in. Creating something in Matthias's name wasn't just symbolic. It was a way of staying in motion when stillness would have been unbearable. A way of giving form to something that otherwise had no shape. She had already lived a life shaped by displacement and loss. She left her home country as a teenager. She navigated exile, cultural alienation, and the psychological weight of watching her homeland under oppression from a distance for decades. Through all of that, she had built a life in Paris that was hers, and at the center of that life, it seems, was him. She channeled some of her grief into creating a foundation in his name. The practical work of honoring him. But foundations and memorials can only do so much. Some losses, it seems, are simply too large. Satrapi died in Paris, a little over a year after Matthias. She was 56 years old. Her family's banditwa statement to the press didn't cite a clinical cause of death. It didn't need to. They said she died of sadness. That phrase, died of sadness, sounds almost poetic, but it points to something real. So what does it actually mean, and why does it matter for how we remember her? What dying of sadness actually means, let's be honest about what we know and what we don't, because this story deserves that. As of the reporting available, no official medical cause of death has been publicly disclosed for Marjane Satrapi. Multiple news outlets, NBC News, Entertainment Weekly, and others, reported that her family and people close to her described it as dying of sadness or dying of grief following the loss of her husband. That is the language her people chose. That is what they wanted the world to know. And that choice of language tells us something important. Grief can be devastating in ways that are clinically real. The concept of broken heart syndrome, a condition where extreme emotional stress causes the heart to malfunction, is medically recognized. Prolonged grief can suppress the immune system, disrupt sleep, affect cardiovascular health. The body and the heart are not separate things, but beyond the physiology, there's something else here. Satrapi had lived a life of enormous emotional weight. She processed displacement, exile, political trauma, and the ongoing grief of watching her home country suffer. And she did it largely through her art. Persepolis was not just a memoir. It was a survival strategy. Her work was how she metabolized pain. When Matthias died, that anchor was gone. And perhaps the creative tools she had relied on her whole life were not enough for this particular loss. Perhaps nothing was. It is worth saying clearly, we don't know the medical specifics. What we know is what her family chose to tell the world, that Marjane Satrapi, one of the most emotionally honest artists of her generation, died of a broken heart. But even in grief, even in death, the legacy she left behind is staggering. So what exactly is the world losing with her gone? The legacy. What the world lost. Marjane Satrapi was not replaceable. That sounds like the kind of thing people say when someone dies, a platitude, a kindness. But in her case, it is simply true. What she did, the specific combination of things she did, has no obvious successor. She took a form, the graphic novel, that was still fighting for literary legitimacy, and used it to tell a story that changed how the Western world understood Iran. She did it with wit and vulnerability, and a refusal to simplify either herself or her country. She showed that a girl from Tehran could be funny and complicated, and politically furious and deeply human, all at once. She then took that work to the cinema and earned an Oscar nomination for it. Then she kept making films. Then she kept speaking out about Iran, about women's rights, about the West's tendency to flatten the Middle East into headlines rather than people. She was 56 when she died. In the context of a creative career, that is not old. There were almost certainly more books, more films, more political interventions that the world will never get. The woman, life, freedom movement in Iran, the uprising she cared so deeply about, is still unfolding. She will not be here to document it. What she left behind is substantial. Persepolis, which will be read for generations. A body of film work. A generation of artists, particularly women artists from the Middle East and its diaspora, who saw in her work proof that their stories mattered, that their voices could reach the world. And she left behind the example of a life lived with total honesty. She did not soften her politics. She did not simplify her identity for Western audiences. She did not pretend that exile was romantic or that grief was manageable. She told the truth, in drawings and in words, and at the end, in the bare fact of her death. The reaction. Why her story hit so hard. When news of her passing started circulating, it didn't land like a typical celebrity headline. It landed like a gut punch people weren't fully prepared for. And maybe that's because Marjane Satrapi was never just a celebrity in the usual sense. She was one of those rare figures who made people feel like they actually knew her through her work. Across social media, the reaction wasn't focused on fame or awards. It was personal. People talked about reading Persepolis for the first time in school, or discovering it in a library, or being handed it by a friend who said, "You need to read this." And suddenly, their understanding of Iran, exile, identity, and even family shifted a little. That's the thing about her work. It didn't just inform people, it re-educated them emotionally. So when her story reached its final chapter, in the way it has been reported, people didn't respond like they were hearing about a distant public figure. They responded like they had lost someone who had quietly shaped their worldview. There's also something uncomfortable in how closely her personal life seemed to mirror the themes she spent decades writing about. Loss, displacement, identity fracture, survival through storytelling. It's almost like her life and her art were constantly chasing each other in circles, refusing to separate. And that's why the phrase "died of sadness," whether taken literally, metaphorically, or somewhere in between, hit such a nerve. People don't usually get language like that in modern news cycles. We get clinical terms, we get brief statements, we get distance, but this story, as it has been told, doesn't give you distance. It pulls you right into the center of it. Still, it's important to hold on to something steady here. The details around her final years and passing, as reported publicly, are not laid out in a strictly medical or fully confirmed way. What we have are accounts, interpretations, and family statements that frame her final chapter through grief and emotional collapse after loss. And maybe that ambiguity is part of why people keep talking about her, because it doesn't feel neatly packaged. It feels human in a way that is almost too raw for the usual celebrity narrative machine. In the end, what people seem to be reacting to is not just the loss of an artist, but the feeling that one of the most emotionally honest storytellers of her generation reached a point where life stopped being something she could translate into art. And that is where the silence becomes loud. Marjane Satrapi was born in a country in revolution, sent into exile as a teenager, rebuilt herself on foreign soil, and became one of the most celebrated artists of her generation. She got an Oscar nomination. She made films that mattered. She used her platform to fight for the women of Iran when it was not easy and not safe to do so. And then she lost the man who was the center of her world, and a little over a year later, she was gone too. At 56, her family said she died of sadness. There is something devastating and also, in its way, deeply true about that. Satrapi spent her entire life insisting that emotional reality mattered, that what people feel under oppression, in exile, in love, in grief, was worth documenting, worth fighting for, worth turning into art. And in the end, her own emotional reality claimed her. That is not a comfortable story. It is not a triumphant one, but it is an honest one. And if there's anything Marjane Satrapi would have wanted, it's that. If this video moved you, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting. And leave a comment below. Which part of Marjane Satrapi's story hit you the hardest? I read every single one.